Hello everyone, happy Sunday, it's Ren here. Hope you are well, guys. Today we're going to be following up from the discussion that I started yesterday. That discussion had to do with what I call being a full INFJ. And by that I was referring to the idea of being an integrated INFJ that's not simply integrated in terms of having a harmonized relationship, achieved a kind of harmonized relationship between all their different functions, but rather, an INFJ who's individuated in such a way that this harmony between their use of the different functions is matched with a level of interaction, with the real world that is also harmonized and integrated. Yesterday I was speaking of the danger of the idea that implicit in the understanding of individuation as a process of development of the individual over against the rest of society. Not that this is what Jung had originally meant by the concept of individuation, but I think it's an understanding that can propagate itself if it's not carefully, analyzed and disentangled. Individuation within society rather than individuation as over against society, if you know what I mean. So I want to explore a bit more this concept of entry point, the idea that, okay, so imagine an INFJ feels as if they're not really equipped to be part of, maybe in the West, like a very secularized, very in the moment technological society, where consumerism, the marketplace reign supreme in many ways, and where things go very quickly, and time frames are so fast. Social media and again, the internet's playing a big role in this. So what are the entry points? How is it possible for an INFJ to kind of insert themselves into the fabric of their world without causing too much, internal inconsistency or stress for them? Maybe it's worth trying to explore that a bit. Now, before I move on, remember that I have written a book on the INFJ personality, The Ecstatic Soul, a new look at the INFJ type. Now, check it out, less than $10, all the links below. It's a lot of people like it. They think it's, more in-depth approach to the INFJ personality than you'll find elsewhere. And if you're into fiction, you can check out my book, The Infinite Castle, came out a bit more recently. Main protagonist, or the protagonist, apparently INFJ, probably a struggling INFJ, an INFJ that embodies a lot of the tensions inherent in integrated society. So maybe you could refer back to Mr. Lynch, who's the name of this character, as a kind of example of someone who maybe doesn't quite manage to integrate in society, the topic we'll discuss today, right? Less than $10 as well. And it's very existential and postmodernist, if you like, that Kafka, Dostoevsky, Camus, and these types of authors. And you support my channel, and you can also support my channel by supporting me on Patreon. There's a link down below to my Patreon page where you can support me from €3 a month. And there's a growing community there where we share content and we exchange, and very grateful for your support. Now, without further ado, let's try to explore a little bit more this concept of entry point. I think that, there is, first of all, before I kind of move into the second half of the video where I begin to share some ideas about what these entry points could be for INFJs, I just want to address briefly a very kind of very good comment, from Breezy in my previous video, the video from yesterday, where Breezy is essentially saying, his comment is a bit long, so I'm not going to read it to you verbatim, but I'll try to, convey the essential meaning without hopefully defacing its meaning. Breezy's point is to say, does it make sense to aim at being a fully integrated INFJ through, among other things, integrating the various functions? So surpassing the temptation to devalue certain functions, for instance, if what lies beneath the insecurities regarding, being a TI user, or regarding FE or regarding SE, whatever it might be, if beneath that is a more sort of a deeper cause, which has to do with psychological injuries. So what I would say is, and of course, in some cases, you can really have insecurities regarding certain functions having to do with psychological injuries. I don't know if it's always the case. I think that unfortunately, or fortunately, sometimes, especially younger people, just embrace certain kinds of, type vocabularies, which encourages them to value certain functions over against others. And that's something that could easily be reversed if, they unlearn some of their acquired vocabularies in the process. So, there is that element. I think that you can actually have an impact, quite, I wouldn't say quickly, but realistically over people if you do manage to convey that notion to them. There's also going to be people who have psychological injuries. What I would say is, for the psychological injuries, I would consider the type vocabulary something to, look at with reserve when it comes to addressing those injuries. If you have psychological injuries, traumas, and you want to address them, you have the strength to address them. That's a good first start. It means that, you have faced the fact that, these exist, and you want to do something about it. There's many things you can do about it. I don't think that among these things that you can do, you should prioritize finding a solution through theories of type. Maybe the type vocabulary can be helpful, but it's much more likely to be less helpful than a much more personalized society having to do with your own life story, leaving aside completely questions of type, as you discuss with a psychotherapist, for example, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, or with some kind of other specialist professional. I think, but again, I'm not such a professional, so I'm not going to give further advice as if I were one. They probably will encourage the person to still challenge themselves to an extent, and not to assume that before they can get into the life of integration into the world, they need to fix their injuries, and then once they're fixed, they can go into the world. It's obviously going to be a back and forth constantly, because often, in order to address your trauma, you need to face some of the sources of your trauma and engage practically with the world outside. So it's going to be a back and forth. But I'd say in these particular instances, the type vocabulary is probably not where you want to go first. Forget about integration or whatever. Now, assuming that we have INFJs, right, that we take as a whole, and that we hold constant the question whether they have psychological injuries. Let's say that they are just like any old person or any old person. They have their injuries, they have their traumas, they also have their strengths, they also have their potentials. They're looking for a way to integrate into society in such a way that they can have an anchoring into the presence that links their past and future, like I was saying in the previous video, but without completely extracting them from their moorings in such a way that they kind of become really alienated and possibly go crazy, because they're just not made for many aspects of society in its current postmodern capitalistic marketplace driven state. I think the idea is that, of course, INFJs can contribute to these societies, and they should not assume that they ought to remain hermits, because that's not a solution. It's only delaying the problem. The idea is more, can you find an entry point in such a way that you can manage those challenges while still remaining in some sense true to yourself and to your integrated self, so you can be an integrated self in an integrated mode of relationship with your society. I do not have the answer to that question. I think that at least a full-fledged answer to that question, maybe to some extent, this will be the challenge, and the goal of my next book. It requires very layered investigation. But, there are some ideas that I have, and some of them are taken from some readings I've been I've been doing lately as well. I take a lot from my readings, and sometimes when there's like a couple of important books, I kind of sense that, okay, those are really going to inform my exploration in my book, in my next book. So one concept that I like, so I'll just share that concept with you again. I'm not pretending I'm going to offer the solution to the entry points, for INFJs here. But one concept I like is a concept in a book of in a couple of books, by the philosopher Charles Taylor. One of the books I'm talking about is called Sources of the Self, and really recommend. And another book that is probably his magnum opus, called A Secular Age. And the concept that I'm thinking about that Charles Taylor uses is what he calls higher times, concept of higher times. And it's quite a complex, layered concept. I'm not sure I can do justice to it completely here, but the idea is that we live in a secular age, not simply in the sense that religion has, receded from our everyday horizon. That religion becomes a matter now of people deciding, oh yeah, this interests me, that interests me, maybe I'll pick this, or maybe I'll be an atheist, or maybe I'll be an agnostic. So Taylor is really retracing that course of history whereby people from earlier eras never even asked themselves that question. They were not faced with that plurality of options, and they were even less faced with having a position in themselves where they can just pick and choose. Because in a sense, that's a marketplace of faith as well. So it's already part of the secular age. People were born into a worldview, and that worldview was full of extrinsic meanings. The world itself was enchanted, as opposed to the disenchantment of modernity, which comes with science, comes with progress in many ways. You could argue that a world where we don't believe in magic is a progress, but at the same time, it's all too easy to look with scorn and maybe a little bit of contempt upon our predecessors who lived in a world, I'm thinking 500, 600 years ago, before the process of secularization started effectively, where there was more enchantment in the world, where objects were not just, to be interpreted through meanings in our minds, but they were vehicles of meaning in themselves. And of course, prominent among them were sacred objects, Christian relics, for example, or objects in the Christian religion, the Christian liturgy, and other religions, but sometimes not necessarily Christian. It could be other religions, it can be other spiritualities, other faiths. But nevertheless, the idea of higher times is the idea that you have secular time, the time of the everyday. Okay, now it's in Ireland it's 1 p.m. The day in our days, we think that we interact with objects and we interact with people in a world where time has become completely secularized. It's the time of now, it's the time of today, and then it will be tomorrow, and then it will be in 10 years. But everything is within this secularized horizon. In opposition to which you have obviously examples of higher times, such as obviously the time of eternity. So the kingdom of heaven, for those who believe in that. The time of Buddhist reincarnation is a form of higher time that transcends our secular time. There's something that comes on top, something that is a vehicle for meaning that transcends in locations that are sometimes secular. So, you walk around town, you're in secular time. You go into a church, you start getting in touch with higher times. The times of, for example, when Christ died on the cross. That is an event that happened at some level in secular time, but it also has a meaning in higher time. It has a meaning forever. And I think that there's a lot of different approaches, ways of reconnecting with this idea of higher times. Nietzsche was really, really interested in reconnecting with the notion of higher times through a certain form of, what he called the eternal return, a certain form of heroism, a transcendence through art and beauty that were atheistic in some sense. For Nietzsche, God is dead. It's not about reconnecting with religion. There's different ways, according to different sensibilities, to reconnect ourselves to a notion of higher times. It's not about living constantly in higher times. We live in a secular world. Our integration is going to be integration into secular societies, but maybe there are these spaces, there's these entry points where you can reconnect with concepts of higher times. Another way to illustrate it is that, our relationship to time is horizontal, but there are places where you can recover a vertical relationship to time, whether, it's a vertical up to God or to some other spirituality. These are places that I think hold enormous potential for meaning in an INFJ's life. And I think that if an INFJ can not only reconnect with those places, reconnect with those localities where higher times are still vibrant, and if they can somehow find a way to connect their life, their everyday, whether it be their relationship, their style of life, their friendship, but also their work, with one of these localities in such a way that there's a logical link between the two, that one makes sense of the other, I think that then the INFJ will be able to tap into those resources that provide them with a relationship to higher times in society today. And if a compromise can be effected, where you can get access to both in practice, in spirit, in theory, at all different levels, I think that you can find here one of your winning syntheses and your winning entry points. But completely understand at the moment this is super abstract. And, if this is interesting to you, I can seek to think about this further, unpack this further, and share more of my reflections. But in the meantime, I have to go because it's been a while. And I have to just wait and see what you come back with. Look forward to your comments, guys. And don't forget about my Patreon page. Really helps. Okay, see you next week. Bye-bye.